reproduce by sexual reproduction. Genes from two parents come and combine to form one single fertilized egg that will form zygote and baby, and then we develop it to an adult. So asexual reproduction involves formation. Asexual reproduction involves two parents. So asexual reproduction involves one single parent and sexual reproduction involves two parents. So human beings reproduce by the method of sexual reproduction. So when two parents are involved, there are more chances of variations being produced in the next generation. So what do you mean by variation? Variation means nothing but related characters but not exactly similar. Related but distinct characters. So variations are nothing but inherited traits from our parents which are related but distinct. So whether it is asexual mode of reproduction or whether it is sexual mode of reproduction, variations always arise. But in asexual reproduction, the number of variations will be less when compared to sexual reproduction. So what visibility of variations due to sexual reproduction? Will there be lot of visibility of variations when there is sexual reproduction? Yes, because when you suppose you are a student and you resemble, some of your characters resemble some from your mother and some from your father. So those are the variations that are resembling in you, either from your mother. You either look like your mother or your father, right? Sometimes grandparents also. But exactly, suppose your nose is that of your mother's nose, but may not be exactly 100% similar, 80% similar. So that is only variations arise here. And these variations are definitely much more visible during the sexual reproduction. Then long-term consequences of accumulation of these variations. What happens when generation after generations these variations keep developing? First generation will have some variation, then that child will start reproducing and then another generation comes. Like this, variations get accumulated over the period of generations. Then what is the long-term consequence of these accumulation of variations? We will be studying in detail in this chapter. So the accumulation of variations during the reproduction process. See, inheritance happens during the generations. That is, traits will be inherited from the parents to the offsprings generations after generations. This is a continuous process. In sexual reproduction, we will be having more number of variations, more number of diversity. More diversity means more of variety, new variety, and then thereby more variations occurs, more inherited new traits come. Whereas variations of species versus chances of survival. See, over the period of many generations, lots of variations will be accumulated. But then, do you think all the species will survive who have got these variations? No. See, suppose taking the example of a group of bacteria. Over the period of generations, bacteria have developed some variations in them. But bacteria are adapted to live in only colder climates. But suppose if suddenly there is a heat wave, due to global warming the temperatures have increased. Then if there is a heat wave, then what happens? Will all the bacteria able to tolerate the heat wave? No. Some of the bacteria, majority of the bacteria will die due to the high heat. That is due to the increased temperatures. Only some amount of bacteria will live. Those which bacteria survived? Those bacteria which had variations in their body. What variation? Variation of bearing the high temperatures. Variations of tolerating the high heat waves. So that group of bacteria only survived. So that example gives us the inference that not all the variations come in. See, this example gives us the inference that all the species having variations will not survive. Okay. So in the chances of survival, so this example gives us the inference. What inference? That suppose there is a high heat wave, not all variated species will survive. Only one group of species who has the variation of tolerating that high heat wave, only that variated species survived. Rest all the bacteria died because they couldn't tolerate the high climate. So all the species which will be born will having the variation, but not all will survive. Only the chances of survival are more from those organisms who can adapt to the surrounding environment changes. Okay, so the variations of species are always related to the chances of survival. Not all species survive. Only those species who are capable to tolerate the extreme changes in the surrounding environment, only these species survive. So the basis of evolution is always the selection of the variants by the environmental factors. So we have seen that bacteria who could tolerate the heat wave, who could tolerate the extreme high temperature only survived. So what has come into account here? The environment, the total surroundings. So always the basis of evolution is selection of the variants by the environmental factors. Always the environmental factors decide that which species will survive, which species with more variations will survive, or species with less variations will survive, and always the environment around the surrounding, the temperature, climate, humidity, moisture, air, all these things decide which species will survive over the period of few generations. So in sexual reproduction, as I told you, two parents are involved. Genes come from two parents, from mother and the father. So that is the reason there are more chances of variations. Whereas in asexual reproduction, only minor variations arise. Why do these minor variations arise? Due to inaccuracies in the DNA replication. For example, bacteria. Bacteria reproduces by asexual reproduction. But only there are minor variations in bacteria because inaccuracies in DNA replication. In the process of reproduction, always the DNA replication will happen. The DNA replication happens from generation to generation. Some inaccuracies in this DNA replication results in variations. So that is the basis of evolution. So the selection of variants by the environmental factors is always the basis of evolution. So now since we are talking about inheritance, genes, heredity, let's understand what is all these things.